and is the largest air evacuation in history, was a tactical, operational, and logistical success, evacuating 124,000 people. The war was a strategic failure. It came also at an incredible cost in the end, with 11 Marines, 1 soldier, and a Navy corpsman. These 13 gave their lives so that people they never met would have an opportunity to live in freedom. And we must remember that the Taliban was and remains a terrorist organization, and they still have not broken with al-Qaeda. I have no illusions who we are dealing with. It remains to be seen whether or not the Taliban can consolidate power or if the country will further fracture into civil war. But we must continue to protect the United States of America and its people from terrorist attacks from Afghanistan. A reconstituted al-Qaeda or ISIS with aspirations to attack the United States is a very real possibility. And those conditions, to include activity in ungoverned spaces, could present themselves in the next 12 to 36 months. That mission will be much harder now, but not impossible, and we will continue to protect the American people. Strategic decisions have strategic consequences. Over the course of 4 presidents, 12 secretaries of defense, 7 chairmen, 10 CENTCOM commanders, and 20 commanders in Afghanistan, and hundreds of congressional delegation visits and 20 years of congressional oversight, there are many lessons to be learned. Among those lessons is the unprecedented speed of the collapse of the ANSF. However, one lesson we can never forget is that every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who served there for 20 years protected our country against attack from terrorists. And for that, we all should be forever grateful, and those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines should be forever proud. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to address a couple of comments about my personal conduct that's been in the media lately.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you may. Go ahead.
I've served this nation for 42 years. I've spent years in combat and buried a lot of my troops who died while defending this country. My loyalty to this nation, its people, and the Constitution hasn't changed and will never change as long as I have a breath to give. My loyalty to the Constitution and to this nation is absolute, and I will not turn my back on my fallen. With respect to the Chinese calls, I routinely communicated with my counterpart, General Lee, with the knowledge and coordination of civilian oversight. I am specifically directed to communicate with the Chinese by Department of Defense guidance in a document known as the Policy Dialogue System. These military-to-military communications at the highest levels are critical to the security of the United States in order to deconflict military actions, manage crisis, and prevent war between great powers armed with nuclear weapons. The calls on 30 October and 8 January were coordinated before and after with Secretary Esper and Acting Secretary Miller's staffs and the interagency. The specific purpose of the October and January calls was generated by concerning intelligence which caused us to believe the Chinese were worried about an attack by the United States. And last night I briefed that intelligence in detail to the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I'll be happy to brief it to any member or group of members at your discretion in a classified session. And I know, and I am certain, President Trump did not intend on attacking the Chinese, and it is my directed responsibility by the Secretary of Defense to convey that intent. My task at that time was to de-escalate. My message was, again, consistent. Calm, steady, de-escalate. We're not going to attack you. At Secretary of Defense Esper's direction, I made a call to General Lee on 30 October. 8 people sat in that call with me, and I read out the call within 30 minutes of the call ending. On 31 December, the Chinese requested a call with me. The Department's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia-Pacific Policy helped coordinate my call, which was then scheduled for 8 January. And he made a preliminary call on 6 January. 11 people attended the call with me, and readouts of this call were distributed to the interagency that same day. On 14 December, then Acting Secretary of Defense Miller had been briefed on the entire program. Shortly after my call ended with General Lee, I informed both Secretary of State Pompeo and White House Chief of Staff Meadows about the call, among several other topics. Soon after that, I attended a meeting with Acting Secretary Miller where I briefed him on the call. Later that same day, on 8 January, Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, called me to inquire about the President's ability to launch nuclear weapons. I sought to assure her that nuclear launch is governed by a very specific and deliberate process. She was concerned and made various personal references characterizing the President. I explained to her that the President is the sole nuclear launch authority, but he doesn't launch them alone, and that I am not qualified to determine the mental health of the President of the United States. There are processes, protocols, and procedures in place, and I repeatedly assured her there is no chance of an illegal, unauthorized, or accidental launch of nuclear weapons. The Presidential Directive and SecDef directives, the Chairman is part of this process to ensure that the President is fully informed when determining the use of the world's deadliest weapons. By law, I am not in the chain of command, and I know that. However, by Presidential Directive and Department of Defense instruction, signed by the President and Secretaries of Defense, I am in the chain of communication to fulfill my legal statutory role as the President's primary military advisor. After the Speaker Pelosi call, I convened a short meeting in my office with key members of my staff to refresh all of us on these procedures, which we practice 3 times a day at the action officer level. Additionally, I immediately informed Acting Secretary of Defense Miller of her call. At no time was I attempting to change or influence the process, usurp authority, or insert myself into the chain of command. But I am expected to give my advice and ensure the President is fully informed on military affairs. I am submitting for the record, and I believe you have it, a couple of memorandums for record, in addition to detailed timelines, and I am happy to discuss in further detail in either classified or unclassified sessions with any or all of you about my actions surrounding these events. I welcome a thorough walkthrough. I'll be happy to provide whatever documents, phone logs, emails, memoranda, witnesses, or anything else you want that'll help you understand these events. My oath is to support the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and I will never turn my back on that oath. I firmly believe in civilian control of the military as a bedrock principle and essential to the health of this republic, and I'm committed to ensuring the military stays clear of domestic politics. Thank you, Chairman, for the extra time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Excuse me. General McKenzie.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, distinguished members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to testify about recent events in Afghanistan. As a theater commander, I will confine my opening remarks to those matters that were under my direct operational control, specifically the withdrawal of U.S. forces and the subsequent non-combatant evacuation operation. These were 2 distinct combat missions, both conducted in contact with the enemy. We had a plan for each of them. We executed those plans. And thanks to the valor and dedication of thousands of men and women in harm's way, we completed both missions, fulfilling the President's order to withdraw all U.S. forces and evacuating over 124,000 non-combatants from Afghanistan. I last appeared before this body only days after President Biden announced his decision to withdraw all U.S. forces from that country, and my testimony regarding that decision is already a matter of public record. I'll only reiterate that I had an opportunity to offer my professional advice to the President through the Secretary, and I am confident that he weighed it carefully. That's all any commander can ask. Once the President made his decision, my headquarters and that of U.S. Forces Afghanistan under General Scott Miller made the withdrawal of our forces our top priority. We did this in close coordination with our allies and partners. Every departure of every element was carefully synchronized across the coalition and with our Afghan partners. On no occasion were they caught unaware by our movements. Every base was handed off to Afghan forces according to a mutually understood plan. This is particularly true of Bagram Airfield. Many of you have visited Bagram at some point over the past 20 years and were probably struck by 2 of its defining features, its sprawling size and its isolation. Virtues for most of its lifespan, they rendered it untenable under the circumstances. The guidance I received in April was to conduct the complete withdrawal of U.S. combat forces and plan for a diplomatic security force of absolutely no more than 650 service members. It was not feasible to preserve the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, hold and defend Hamid Karzai International Airport, the embassy's key link to the outside world, and also defend Bagram Airfield with 650 soldiers and Marines. This is important. The Bagram option went away when we were ordered to reduce our presence to the 650 personnel in Kabul. I'd like to shift briefly to the NEO, which, as I have noted, was a completely different operation than the withdrawal. They were separate. The withdrawal began in April following the President's direction. The decision to conduct a NEO rested with the Department of State, and they made that decision on 14 August. In our NEO planning, Central Command assumed that we would have to bring out a very large number of people. We did not regard the size of a potential NEO as overwhelming or too much to accomplish. We did not regard a Taliban takeover as inevitable, but neither did we rule it out. And we identified critical indicators of an impending collapse of the Afghan National Defense Forces. We crafted branches to our base plan to account for a complete collapse of the Afghan security forces. The Secretary took action in May to make forces available to me for planning. On July the 9th, I requested that our base NEO force, the core package that would go in, be put on 96-hour prepare-to-deploy orders. By August 11th, it was evident to me that Kabul was at risk, and I requested the deployment of a brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division and other elements of our own alert pre-planned force package. And I requested that they be deployed into HKIA, Hamid Karzai International Airfield. These forces flowed swiftly into theater, even as the Afghan National Defense Forces disintegrated, allowing thousands of civilians access to the airfield. Working with Afghan partners composed of elite commando units who did not fall apart, and our arriving NEO forces, on August the 16th, we cleared the airfield and resumed flight operations in a matter of hours. With security reestablished by a force ultimately comprising 5,784 U.S. troops, 8 maneuver battalions, and hundreds of coalition forces, operations continued without interruption until our final flights. By that time, we evacuated over 124,000 people from Afghanistan. This was a difficult mission, made possible by the exceptional professionalism and valor of the joint force on the ground in Afghanistan and across the entire world. I would specifically like to use this opportunity to thank the C-17 crews of the Air Mobility Command for a feat rivaling and exceeding, in fact, the Berlin airlift. Moments after the last of the final 5 C-17s lifted off from HKIA, I held a briefing with the Pentagon press corps and expressed my gratitude and admiration for the forces who carried out this NEO. I also provided various figures that conveyed the magnitude of their accomplishment. I won't reiterate those figures here and now, but I will say that after the passage of nearly a month, my pride in their accomplishment remains undiminished. I don't need to tell this body that on 26 August, 11 Marines, 1 sailor, and 1 soldier made the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of their country. We will never forget them. This was a combat operation of the most difficult sort, a non-combatant evacuation carried out in contact with the enemy. The enemy in this case was ISIS Khorasan, a vile, tenacious foe that would undoubtedly have killed many, many more Americans and innocent Afghans at HKIA if it were not for the vigilance of our forces there. On 29 August, we undertook an MQ-9 strike against what we thought was an imminent threat to HKIA. That strike was a mistake, and I take full responsibility for that strike. I was under no pressure from any quarter to conduct the strike. It was based on our intelligence read of the situation on the ground. While in many cases we were right with our intelligence and forestalled ISIS-K attacks, in this case we were wrong, tragically wrong. I appreciate that there are many other topics of interest to this committee, and I look forward to answering your questions on all of them. I'll close here by reiterating my profound gratitude and appreciation for every soldier, sailor, Marine, airman, and guardian, as well as our intelligence and Department of Defense and Department of State comrades who contributed to each of these difficult missions. I remain humbled by their sense of duty and courage. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I want to drill down a little bit on keeping 2,500 troops there. And I'm struck as I listen to the comments that I think the real problem here is you have to make decisions in the real world. You don't get to imagine an outcome that would make it more palatable. And I think that's what really factored into the 2,500. And as we talk about the 13 service members who died and attack the leadership here for not having prevented that, how you can do that and then advocate that we should have stayed in Afghanistan longer so that more service members, I guess the only way you can advocate that is to imagine a scenario whereby we could have stayed in a chaotic war zone, not had soldiers get killed, not have made any mistakes. You know, how you can not make mistakes in that chaotic environment, I don't know. And every member serving on this committee has been in those environments in one way or another. So you don't have the luxury of waving a magic wand and making all the problems go away and simply making a decision where nothing goes wrong. And it's really frustrating to hear people advocate that we should stay and still decry what happened. Do you think fighting in a war zone, there wouldn't be similar mistakes if we had stayed there for another 5 or 10 years? More civilians killed accidentally, more U.S. service members dead in exactly the same way that we just saw? Sorry, that's very frustrating. But could you talk to us a little bit about the 2,500 service members who could have been left there, and how you approach that decision, and what exactly, well, not what exactly your advice was to the president for what I said earlier, but how you approach that decision and how you attempt to deal with that while advising the president.
Well, first of all, Chairman, let me be clear that I support the President's decision to end the war in Afghanistan. I did not support staying in Afghanistan forever. And let me also say, we've talked about the process that we use to provide input to the President. I think that process was a very thorough and inclusive policy process, and the recommendations of the commanders were taken into consideration, discussed, and deliberated on throughout that process. As you indicated, I will always keep my recommendations to the President confidential, but I would say that in my view, there was no risk-free status quo option. I think that the Taliban had been clear that if we stayed there longer, they were going to recommence attacks on our forces. I think while it's conceivable that you could stay there, my view is that you would have had to deploy more forces in order to protect ourselves and accomplish any missions that we would have been assigned. It's also my view, Mr. Chairman, that the best way to end this war was through a negotiated settlement, and sadly, that did not happen.
Thank you. And let me just also say that I know there are members of this committee who think we should have stayed, who are honest about that advocation. I think of Congressman Waltz, who has been very honest about the fact, both under President Trump and under President Biden, that we should have stayed. He's very honest about the fact that there were costs and risks and lives would have been lost. That's the type of discussion that we need to have. But to jump down the president's throat because he actually had to make the decision in an impossible situation, I think does a grave disservice to this committee's ability to do effective and honest, nonpartisan oversight. Costs were going to be borne here. There was no easy option. And I do hope that people will remember that as we go through the questions and answers that will proceed. With that, I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Milley, was the DOD in charge of making decisions about troop strength in this withdrawal, or were you in a support role?
Let me put it this way. You talking about the NEO, or what
I'm
part of the
talking
mission?
about, well, let me just go back even further.
Okay.
In January of this year, were you of the opinion, in your professional military judgment, that we should have maintained 2,500 troops, U.S. troops, in support of the coalition effort and contractors in Afghanistan?
Yeah, my assessment that I read in the opening statement remained consistent. Did
that professional military opinion change over the course of the next few months?
Not until a presidential decision, and I rendered my opinions, and there was a fulsome debate on all of that. And once decisions are made, then I'm expected to execute lawful orders.
And you've made that very clear. So my question is, when the troop levels were ordered to be drawn down to 0 and first stopping at 650, as General McKenzie outlined, was that your decision or General McKenzie's decision to draw down to 650?
It was a task and then a troop-to-task analysis, with the task being to go to 0, but you also have to defend The embassy. So how many?
I'm thinking about the chain of command. Somebody's making decisions about troop levels, and my understanding is it was not the DOD, it was the State Department or the White House. I want to know who said we're going to go from 2,500 to 650 and just protect Kabul and the State Department.
It was a military analysis that 600 to 700 could adequately defend the embassy until contractors come up, and that was then approved up through the chain and approved at the highest levels.
Who made the decision?
I would say that that decision was made in a national security consultative process by the highest levels of our government.
General McKenzie, did you receive advice from General Miller in the end of 20 and early 21 related to troop levels in Afghanistan?
Ranking Member, I did.
What was that advice?
The advice, his view and my view were essentially the same view. And my view was that we needed to maintain about 2,500 and that we also needed to work with our coalition partners who had about 6,000 troops in there, NATO and other core countries that would remain there.
Did your professional military opinion change over the course of the spring?
It did not.
Did you communicate? Well, I know you communicated to the president. You said you did. Were you present in the room when General Miller's recommendations were relayed to the president?
Without going, General Miller was present in executive sessions that involved myself, the secretary here, the chairman, and the president.
And those recommendations of the parties, as Secretary Austin said, were debated fully in that meeting.
They were debated fully. I felt that my opinion was heard with great thoughtfulness by the president.
Well, you know, Secretary Austin just made the point that there was a fulsome debate of the pros and cons and the costs and risks. Yet, in August of this year, President Biden told George Stephanopoulos in an interview, no one said that to me, referring to keeping some 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. Was that an inaccurate statement by the president?
Sir, I am not going to comment on a statement by the president.
Okay. General McKenzie, in mid-June, your commanders on the ground were informing you that things were deteriorating. As you testified a little while ago, at that time, in your judgment, you should stop withdrawal and increase forces and or proceed with the retrograde. What did you decide at that time?
We decided to proceed with the retrograde.
Okay. Was were you ordered to do that by the president?
We followed our original orders. We followed those orders through to completion.
Okay. Was it the president's orders?
My orders come from the Secretary of Defense through to the President, so it's a very short chain of command for me.
Okay. Secretary Austin, on the 23rd, you told this committee that you had developed a very detailed plan to conduct safe, orderly, and responsible withdrawal, and were executing that plan. On August 18th, the President said, quote, "The idea that somehow there was going to be a way that we could have gotten out with chaos ensuing, I don't know how that happens," close quote. How do you reconcile those discrepancies between what you assured the Congress and what the President's telling us?
Thank you, sir. First of all, in terms of the withdrawal of our troops and the retrograde of equipment, that plan, as developed by General Miller and General McKenzie, was executed as planned, and all of our equipment was retrograded. And we drew down the force that we wanted to draw down to that very small force that you saw at the embassy at the very end there. The chaos that ensued followed the collapse of the military and the collapse of the government. And when those two things happened, then it was going to be a chaotic situation.
And the collapse of the government and the collapse of the military was solely the responsibility of this administration. I know y'all are trying to be careful politically, but it was the State Department and the White House that told you how to make those drawdown of troops from 2,500 to 650 to 0. It was the speed with which they done it, that they carried out that order. That's what caused the chaos that we have. If they'd allowed the DOD to be in a command situation, we wouldn't have had this problem. General McKenzie's testified that the only reason he couldn't keep Bagram was because he had to draw down to 650 troops, and his primary orders were to keep Hamid Karzai and the State Department safe. We just have to admit this was the State Department and the White House that caused this catastrophe, not the Defense Department. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Landry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, and I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today and for your service to our nation. my constituents and I have obviously a lot of questions about the planning that led up to this. And I'll admit that I'm concerned that based on the conditions on the ground, General Milley and General